The morning light struggled to penetrate the reinforced glass of the Lee estate, casting long, clinical shadows across Nayun's private library. A master tailor moved silently around him, pinning the sleeve of a charcoal gray three-piece suit that felt more like a suit of armor than clothing. Nayun stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the wall of 4K security monitors embedded in the mahogany. Each screen was a silent testament to his absolute rule over Seoul. Every street corner, every warehouse, and every hallway of this mansion was under his thumb. "The merger is finalized," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding distant and cold. "You've officially erased the last of the opposition, sir. The city is yours." Nayun nodded absently, the heavy silence of the room usually acting as a comfort, a symbol of the peace he had bought with blood. He lived a life of meticulous discipline, a man who prided himself on knowing the location of every grain of dust in his domain. He was the hunter, the untouchable architect of his own destiny. Then, the world tilted. As he reached for a leather-bound journal on the lowest shelf, his fingers brushed a hidden mechanical latch. With a groan of ancient gears, the heavy oak library shelf swung inward, revealing a darkness the security cameras had never captured. Nayun stepped inside, his breath hitching as a single, flickering light bulb buzzed to life. The sharp, disciplined aura of the Iron King vanished in an instant. His eyes went wide, his shoulders turning rigid with a primitive fear he hadn't felt in 15 years. There, pinned to the wall with obsessive precision, were hundreds of surveillance photos of him. Photos of him eating, photos of him meeting associates, and most chillingly, a photo of him sleeping in his bed from only 3 hours ago. Red strings webbed across the room, connecting his face to the scratch-out portraits of the family members he had betrayed to reach the top. In the center of the room sat a single, empty chair, still warm, facing the back of his own office chair through a one-way mirror. Nayun's knees buckled. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest: he wasn't the hunter. He was the trophy. If this discovery sent a shiver down your spine, smash that like button and share this video with someone who loves a dark mystery. Subscribe and hit the bell, because next week we're dropping the story of a disinherited heir who returned from the dead to reclaim a blood-stained fortune. The shelf groaned, a sound of heavy wood dragging against stone, as it swung inward to reveal a jagged slit of darkness. Nayun stood frozen, the fine fabric of his charcoal suit feeling suddenly restrictive, like a shroud. A single step forward carried him across the threshold, and as his weight hit the floorboards inside, a lone, exposed light bulb overhead flickered to life with a sharp, electric hum. The air in the room was stale, smelling of cold copper and old paper. Nayun's breath hitched. This wasn't a storage closet or a forgotten architectural fluke. It was a nerve center of meticulous, terrifying focus. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, darted across the walls. They were papered from floor to ceiling with hundreds of photographs. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he reached toward a snapshot of himself entering a private club 3 weeks ago. Then his gaze shifted to another, a long-lens shot of him through his own bedroom window, captured while he slept. The realization was a physical blow to his gut. Someone had been standing just outside his glass, watching him breathe, while he had slept in the supposed safety of his fortress. A web of red twine crisscrossed the walls, connecting the photos of his daily life to older, grainier images. These were the ghosts he had tried to bury: his father's funeral, the fiery wreckage of a competitor's car, and the faces of the lieutenants he had cleared to consolidate his power. But as he looked closer, his blood turned to ice. Every face in those older portraits, the men he had betrayed or eliminated, had been violently scratched out with what looked like a jagged blade, leaving nothing but white, shredded paper where their eyes should be. In the center of the cramped space stood a single, wooden chair, its seat worn smooth. Directly in front of it was a wide pane of glass. Na-yun realized with a jolt of nausea that it was a one-way mirror. From this chair, the occupant could sit in the dark and watch Na-yun work at his desk, just inches away, separated only by a sliver of silvered glass and a lifetime of lies. He moved to the chair, his legs feeling like lead. On the small side table next to it lay a pair of binoculars and a discarded candy wrapper, a brand his younger brother, Ji-hoon, used to love. Na-yun sank onto the chair, the Iron King of Seoul collapsing in the face of a truth he couldn't bribe or bullet his way out of. He wasn't the master of this house. He was the subject of a masterpiece of revenge, and the artist was still in the building. The cold realization of the one-way mirror was only the beginning. Na-yun stood up, his legs feeling like leaden pillars, and began to follow the frantic geometry of the red strings. They weren't just connections, they were a roadmap of his own undoing. He traced a line from a grainy photo of a cargo ship to a newspaper clipping dated 6 months ago, * inexplicable engine failure leads to multimillion-dollar loss at Incheon port. * at the time, Na-yun had blamed his logistics manager, a man he had subsequently retired with brutal efficiency. But here, pinned behind the clipping, was a technical schematic of the ship's fuel system with a specific valve circled in the same aggressive red ink. It hadn't been incompetence. It had been a surgical strike from within his own house. His fingers, usually steady enough to handle a firearm without a tremor, shook as they followed another string toward a photo of a high-ranking government official. Next to it was a transcript of a private phone call Na-yun had made from his office, a call he thought was encrypted, a call that had resulted in a sudden, devastating regulatory raid on his front companies. The string led directly back to a small, black microphone taped to the underside of the very desk he had sat at every morning, unsuspecting and arrogant. Every stroke of bad luck, every market fluctuation, and every unforeseen betrayal that had bled his empire over the last year was mapped out here with the cold precision of a grandmaster's endgame. He saw the patterns now, the missed shipments weren't accidents, and the sudden drop in stock prices wasn't the economy. It was a slow-acting poison, a systematic dismantling of his life's work by someone who knew his every move before he even made it. The timeline on the wall ended at a photo from yesterday. It was a shot of Na-yun looking into the library mirror, adjusting his tie, looking every bit the king. But pinned over his heart in that photo was a final, heavy red string that didn't lead to a past event. It hung loose, dangling toward the floor, ending in a sharp, silver fishhook that swayed slightly in the draft from the open shelf. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in with the weight of 15 years of accumulated debt. Na-yun realized with a sickening lurch in his chest that his brother hadn't just been watching him, he had been orchestrating a symphony of ruin. He had let Na-yun believe he was the master of the city, only to show him that he was nothing more than a puppet whose strings had finally been pulled tight. The Iron King was standing in the center of his own graveyard, and for the first time in his life, he was truly, utterly powerless. The heavy scent of the secret room began to shift as Na-yun moved deeper into the shadows, away from the mocking glow of the light bulb. Beneath the sharp, metallic tang of the electronics and the dry smell of old paper, there was something more visceral, the faint, lingering aroma of yeast and salt. He followed the scent to a small, recessed alcove hidden behind a ventilation duct. His hand, once capable of ordering the deaths of dozens without a flinch, now hovered over a small pile of debris with a sickening dread. There, tucked neatly away as if in a mockery of a kitchen pantry, were the remnants of a life lived in the dark. He found a stack of empty water bottles, the high-end artisan brands served exclusively in his dining room, their labels meticulously peeled off. Beside them lay a silver fork, tarnished and dull, bearing the Lee family crest, an heirloom he thought had been lost during the last renovation. The most jarring sight, however, was a small porcelain plate containing the dried crusts of a wagyu steak and a smear of truffle juice. It was a portion of his own dinner from 3 nights ago. Na-yun felt a wave of nausea roll through him. He remembered that meal clearly. He had complained to his chef that the portion felt smaller than usual, a trivial detail he had dismissed as a kitchen error. Now, he realized he hadn't been eating alone. While he sat in the cold, cavernous grandeur of his dining hall, someone had been crouching just inches away behind the wainscoting, sharing his meal like a parasite feeding on a host. He reached out and touched the edge of the plate. It was still cool to the touch, but the crumbs were fresh. This wasn't a historical record of a squatter, it was a living, breathing presence. He found a small pile of discarded wrappers, the same cheap, plum-flavored candies Ji-hoon used to hoard as a child, their vibrant purple foil clashing garishly with the muted gray of the dust. Na-yun's gaze traveled upward to a small slit in the ventilation grate. From that vantage point, the ghost would have had a perfect, unobstructed view of Na-yun's face as he ate, watched his expressions, and listened to his private ruminations. The realization that he had been providing for his own hunter, literally feeding the man who was dismantling his life, shattered the last of his composure. He wasn't just being watched, he was being maintained. He was the livestock in a pen of his own making, being fattened for a slaughter he had already paid for. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, finally sliced through his pride as he realized the intruder didn't just know his secrets, he knew his scent, his habits, and the sound of his swallowing. The house wasn't a fortress anymore, it was a digestive tract, and Na-yun was being consumed from the inside out. The realization of the ghost's presence didn't just explain the sounds in the walls, it cast a lethal new light on Na-yun's own failing body. He leaned against the damp brick of the alcove, his hand instinctively moving to his chest where his heart fluttered with a strange, uneven rhythm. For months, he had blamed the creeping lethargy on the weight of his crown, the endless board meetings, the midnight assassinations, the crushing pressure of 1,000 enemies. He had been visiting the city's finest doctors, all of whom had found nothing but stress-induced exhaustion. His eyes drifted to the small side table in the corner of the secret room. Among the scraps of food and the surveillance notes sat a familiar amber bottle. It was an exact replica of the high-potency vitamin supplement Na-yun took every morning at 7 a.m. sharp. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and picked it up. The label was identical, but as he tilted the bottle into the light, he noticed a fine, grayish dust clinging to the inner rim, a residue that didn't belong in a pharmaceutical-grade capsule. A flash of memory struck him, the way the Iron King prided himself on his clockwork routine. Every morning, a maid left the bottle on his silver breakfast tray. Every morning, he swallowed a single pill without a second thought. He looked at the discarded wrappers on the floor and then back at the bottle. He realized then that the ghost didn't even need to touch him to kill him. Through the one-way mirror, his brother had watched him take his medicine every single day, perhaps even smiling as Na-yun unknowingly poisoned himself. He unscrewed the cap and smelled it. Beneath the synthetic scent of the vitamins was the faint, bitter odor of digitalis, a heart-slowing toxin derived from foxglove. It was a slow, patient murder. It wouldn't stop his heart today, or tomorrow, but it would ensure that when the final confrontation came, the Iron King would be too weak to lift a weapon, too clouded to think, and too breathless to scream. Na-yun sank to the floor of the hidden room, the bottle slipping from his hand and rolling across the dusty boards. The irony was a jagged blade in his gut. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, only to be slowly dissolved from the inside by a ghost who didn't even have to break a lock. He wasn't just losing his empire, he was losing his life to a man he had already killed once before. The hunter had become the host, and the medicine had become the shroud. He wasn't just being watched, he was being curated for his own funeral. The poisoned bottle of vitamins felt heavy in Na-yun's hand, a small, plastic anchor dragging him into a sea of paranoia. He didn't just feel weak anymore, he felt transparent. Every staggered breath he took seemed to echo through the hollow spaces behind the drywall, likely being recorded and catalogued by the very man who had once shared his blood. He stood up, the room spinning for a brief, nauseating moment before his vision cleared. He couldn't stay in the hidden room. It was a cage, a display case for his own failure. He pushed the heavy library shelf open, stepping back into the clinical, sun-drenched silence of his office. The transition was jarring. To any observer, he was still the Iron King, standing amongst his leather-bound books and high-tech monitors. But Na-Yun knew better. He knew the walls were no longer solid. He walked toward the floor-to-ceiling mirror near the door, intending to straighten his tie and reclaim some fragment of his dignity. But as he approached the glass, a flicker of movement caught the corner of his eye. It wasn't his own reflection. Deep in the silvered depths of the mirror, back in the darkness of the library he had just left, a shadow had detached itself from the bookshelves. It was a silhouette, lean, swift, and entirely too familiar. It vanished before Na-Yun could even blink, slipping behind a corner with a fluid, ghostly grace. The adrenaline hit his system like a lightning strike, momentarily burning through the digitalis-induced fog. Ji-hoon, he whispered, the name tasting like ash. Na-Yun didn't call his security team. To involve them would be to admit that his fortress had been breached, that his crown was tarnished. Instead, he reached into the hollowed-out base of a bronze statue on his desk and pulled out a sleek, suppressed handgun. His movements were jagged, driven by a frantic, desperate energy. He began the hunt. He moved through the mansion like a man possessed, tearing aside heavy velvet curtains and kicking open the doors to guest rooms that hadn't been slept in for years. He ignored the confused stares of the household staff, his eyes wide and bloodshot, scanning every ventilation grate and shadow-filled corner. He was a king searching for a rat in his palace, but with every empty room he entered, the sickening truth became clearer: he wasn't hunting the shadow. The shadow was leading him. He found himself in the north wing, the oldest part of the estate. The air here was colder, the light dimmer. As he rounded the corner into the portrait gallery, he saw it again, a flash of dark fabric disappearing into a narrow maintenance closet at the far end of the hall. Na-Yun sprinted, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs in a dangerous, erratic rhythm. He threw the closet door open, his weapon raised, his finger tightening on the trigger. But there was no one there. Only a small, round hole cut into the floorboards, leading down into the dark, suffocating crawlspaces of the house. From the depths of the hole, a faint, rhythmic clicking sound drifted up, the sound of someone typing on a keyboard, or perhaps, the ticking of a clock. The clicking sound wasn't a clock, it was the rhythmic, hollow tap of a digital playback device echoing through the subfloor. Na-Yun dropped to his knees, his expensive suit trousers gathering dust as he leaned his ear toward the dark opening in the maintenance closet. The air rising from the crawlspace was frigid and smelled of damp earth, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled luxury of the floors above. Suddenly, the clicking stopped, replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards. A voice erupted from a hidden speaker somewhere in the darkness below, distorted by age but unmistakable in its cold, arrogant precision. It was Na-Yun's own voice. "The bloodline is a weakness," the recording played, the sound crisp and haunting. "If we are to survive the transition, the branches must be pruned. Start with Ji-hoon. He's too soft, too prone to sentiment. Make it look like a rival hit. I want it finished before dawn." Na-Yun recoiled as if he'd been struck. The recording was from 15 years ago, the night of the Great Purge. He remembered that night with a clinical detachment, the rain against the window of his limousine, the weight of the gold watch on his wrist, and the calculated decision to trade his brother's life for the chairman's seat. He had told himself it was a necessity, a strategic move to prevent a civil war within the syndicate. But hearing the words now, played back in the very house where he had grown up, the strategic necessity sounded like what it truly was, a cold-blooded execution of the only person who had ever loved him without an agenda. "Did you hear that, brother?" a new voice whispered, not from the speaker, but seemingly from the very shadows surrounding him. It was raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The branches were pruned. "But you forgot that some trees grow from the roots up." Nayan spun around, his gun shaking in his grip, but the hallway remained empty. The recording began to loop, his own voice repeating the command, *, make it look like a rival hit. "Finish it before dawn *, over and over, a digital ghost haunting the present." The sound seemed to come from every wall simultaneously, a surround sound indictment of his soul. The weight of his past sins, combined with the slow-acting toxin in his blood, made the world tilt. He realized that Ji-hoon hadn't just been sabotaging his business or poisoning his tea, he had been preparing a mirror. For 15 years, Na-yeon had lived as a king, convinced of his own righteousness. But in the dim light of the maintenance closet, listening to the echoes of his own cruelty, the Iron King looked down at his hands and finally saw the stains that no amount of power could ever wash away. The hunt was no longer about survival, it was about the horrific realization that the monster he was searching for in the walls was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. The looping recording of his own betrayal was suddenly cut short by a harsh, synthesized screech. Throughout the mansion, the hum of the climate control died, replaced by the heavy, mechanical thud of secondary security bolts sliding into place. Na-yeon lunged for the maintenance closet door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it, the electronic lock engaging with a finality that echoed like a gavel. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing the narrow corridor in a bruised, industrial red. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in his throat. He sprinted toward his primary office, his sanctuary, only to find the heavy steel-reinforced doors already sealed. His own security system, the multi-million-dollar, impenetrable shield he had designed to keep the world at bay, had turned its teeth inward. "System override," Na-yeon barked at the wall-mounted keypad, his voice cracking. "Code Alpha 79er." The screen didn't flash green. Instead, it displayed a grainy, black-and-white video of a young Ji-hoon, laughing in the garden of this very house decades ago. The laughter was silent, a ghostly pantomime of a brotherhood Na-yeon had traded for power. Then, the office door hissed open just an inch. Na-yeon didn't hesitate. He slipped through the gap, his gun raised, only to have the door slam shut behind him, locking with a definitive hydraulic hiss. He was in his panic room, a windowless, soundproofed vault designed to withstand a siege. But as the lights hummed to life, he realized the room wasn't empty. A figure sat in his executive chair, draped in the shadows of the one-way mirror. The air in the vault was thick with the scent of those cheap, plum-flavored candies. The intruder didn't move, but the monitors on the wall began to flicker, showing every angle of the mansion's exterior. Outside, the world continued as if nothing were wrong, while inside this steel box, the Iron King was finally cornered. "You always said this room was the only place you felt safe, brother," a voice rasped from the chair. It was the same voice from the shadows, now clear and terrifyingly close. "Because here, no one can hear the screams. No one can see the truth. It's the perfect place for a reckoning." Na-yeon's finger tightened on the trigger, but his vision blurred, the slow-acting poison finally claiming his focus. The shadow in the chair stood up, tall and lean, moving with a limp that Na-yeon recognized, the result of the very accident he had orchestrated 15 years ago. The fortress had become a tomb, and for the first time, Na-yeon realized that the person who held the keys was the man he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. He was locked in with his past, and there was no exit. The shadow in the executive chair shifted, and for a moment, the only sound in the reinforced vault was the wet, ragged rhythm of Nayan's own struggling breath. As the figure stepped into the harsh, clinical glow of the overhead LED, the Iron King felt the last of his composure dissolve. It was like looking into a shattered mirror. Ji-hoon's face, once the soft, youthful image of their mother, was now a map of trauma. A thick, ropey scar cut a jagged path from his temple to his jaw, pulling the corner of his left eye into a permanent, haunted squint. His skin was the color of parchment, the result of a decade lived in the sunless hollows of the mansion, but his eyes burned with a terrifying, lucid heat. "You look like you've seen a ghost, brother," Ji-hoon said, his voice a rasping echo of the boy who had once begged for mercy in the rain. "But ghosts don't bleed. And they certainly don't forget." Nayan tried to raise his weapon, but the digitalis had turned his arm into lead. The handgun clattered to the floor, sliding across the polished steel. Ji-hoon didn't reach for it. Instead, he lifted his right hand to reveal a small, industrial-grade detonator. A single thumb rested over a glowing red button. "I didn't just build a room in your walls, Nayan. I built a pyre," Ji-hoon whispered, stepping closer until the scent of plum candy was overwhelming. "Every structural pillar, every gas line, every secret exit you used to feel safe, they've all been wired. The family legacy, the blood-soaked ledger, the Iron King's throne, it's all sitting on a bed of C4. Nayan sank to his knees, his vision blurring as he looked up at the man he had tried to erase. The power dynamic that had defined his life for 15 years evaporated in the stale air of the panic room. He saw the surveillance photos on the monitors behind Ji-hoon, thousands of hours of his life captured by the brother he thought was Ash. He saw the red strings. He saw the end. "You won't do it," Nayan wheezed, clutching his chest as his heart skipped a heavy, painful beat. "You die too." Ji-hoon smiled, a slow, tragic expression that didn't reach his scarred eye. "I died 15 years ago, in the back of that sedan you sent to the docks. I've just been waiting for you to join me." He leaned down, his face inches from Nayan's. "Tell me, before I press this. Was the view from the top worth the price of my soul?" The silence that followed was heavier than the steel walls surrounding them. Nayan looked into the eyes of the man he had broken, and for the first time, the Iron King found he had no lies left to tell. The red light of the detonator pulsed like a dying heart, rhythmically illuminating the scars on Ji-hoon's face. Nayan gripped the edge of the steel table, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The digitalis was a heavy fog in his veins, but the reality of the moment was a searing blade of clarity. He looked at the suppressed handgun lying on the floor, the cold, efficient tool he had used to carve his path to the throne. It was only a few feet away. One desperate lunge, one final, cleaning operation, and the threat would be gone. He could kill his brother again, and this time, he could make sure the ash stayed buried. "One choice, Nayan," Ji-hoon whispered, his thumb trembling slightly against the trigger. "The empire or the soul. You can reach for that gun. You're faster than I am, even with the poison. You could end this right now and keep your crown. Or, you can walk out of that door and never look back." Nayan looked at the monitors, at the sprawling estate he had spent 15 years perfecting, and then back at the shattered man standing before him. He saw the red strings on the wall of the hidden room in his mind's eye, the map of a life built on a foundation of ghosts. He realized that every brick of this mansion was mortared with the blood of the only person who had truly known him. If he killed Ji-hoon now, he wouldn't be saving his kingdom, he would be sealing his own tomb. "The view was never worth it," Nayan wheezed, the words tearing at his throat. He didn't reach for the gun. Instead, he forced his leaden legs to move, dragging himself toward the reinforced door. Every step was a battle against the lethargy in his limbs and the pride in his heart. Ji-hoon watched him, his expression unreadable, the detonator still gripped tight. Na-yeon reached the keypad, his fingers fumbling. He didn't enter the security code. He entered the bypass for the emergency ventilation, a code only the two of them knew from their childhood games in the library. The heavy locks disengaged with a mournful groan. Na-yeon leaned against the frame, looking back one last time. Take it all, Ji-hoon. The money, the blood, the throne. It was always a prison anyway. He stepped out into the hallway, leaving the weapon on the floor. He wasn't the Iron King anymore. He was just a man walking through a burning house, waiting to see if the fire would finally set him free or consume what was left of him. Behind him, the clicking of the detonator stopped, replaced by a heavy, hollow silence. The night air was suddenly torn apart by a low, guttural roar as the internal gas lines, tampered with by Ji-hoon's surgical precision, ignited in a synchronized chain reaction. Na-yeon stood on the manicured lawn, his lungs burning from the exertion of his escape, as the fortress he had called home became a hollowed-out pillar of fire. The reinforced glass windows, shatterproof and bullet-resistant, exploded outward like diamonds under a hammer, showering the driveway in a rain of crystalline debris. From the upper wing, the library where the nightmare had begun collapsed into the inferno. The leather-bound books, the high-tech surveillance monitors, and the secret room with its web of red strings were all being purified by the heat. 15 years of secrets, sins, and unholy alliances were turning into gray ash that drifted toward the Seoul skyline like the ghosts of the men Na-yeon had once sacrificed. As the first sirens wailed in the distance, the fire reached the central core. The grand staircase, carved from century-old oak, vanished into the maw of the blaze. There was no one left to witness the fall of the Lee family legacy. The security guards had fled when the systems went dark, and the Iron King was now nothing more than a silhouette against the orange glare. When the fire department finally subdued the beast hours later, the mansion was a blackened skeleton, a jagged tooth of stone and steel biting into the dawn. Forensic teams and police investigators combed through the ruins with meticulous care, their boots crunching on the charred remains of a criminal empire. They searched for the bodies they expected to find, the boss and the intruder, but the heat had been so intense that the interior was a featureless wasteland of melted metal. No remains were ever recovered. No DNA was found in the ash. The only evidence of what had truly happened that night lay at the very edge of the property, where the sprawling forest met the estate's rear boundary. There, in a patch of damp, undisturbed mud near an old drainage pipe, were two distinct sets of footprints. One set was heavy and uneven, suggesting a limp, the other was light, the steps of a man who had finally dropped the weight of a crown. The tracks led away from the fire, deep into the darkness of the trees, side by side until they vanished onto the hard, frozen earth of the mountain path. The Iron King was dead, and in his place, two brothers had walked into the morning, leaving nothing behind but smoke and the silence of a debt finally paid. Thousands of miles from the charred ruins of Seoul, a small greenhouse sits nestled in a quiet valley where the air smells of damp moss and jasmine. In the early morning mist, a man who once commanded an empire with a flick of his wrist now moves with a different kind of precision. He wears worn denim and a simple linen shirt, his hands stained not with ink or blood, but with the dark, rich soil of a thriving garden. Lee Na-yeon, once the Iron King, is now a silent apprentice to the earth. Nearby, Ji-hoon sits on a wooden bench, his scarred face softened by the dappled sunlight. He still moves with a limp, but the haunted heat in his eyes has been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. They don't speak of the past, the secret rooms, the poison, or the night the world burned. Here, in this hidden life, silence is their greatest sanctuary. Nayan pauses to prune a stray branch from a flowering shrub, his movements careful and patient. He spent a lifetime building walls of steel and glass, believing that absolute control was the only path to safety. He had lived in a fortress that was secretly a cage, surrounded by cameras that saw everything but understood nothing. He had mistaken power for freedom, only to realize that a throne built on the betrayal of one's own blood is just a prison with more expensive furniture. The moral of his long, dark journey is written in the very dirt beneath his fingernails. No amount of surveillance or high-tech security can protect a man from the weight of his own conscience. A conscience is a shadow that lives in the walls of the heart, it cannot be locked out, and it never sleeps. True power was never found in the ability to destroy enemies or hoard wealth, but in the courage to walk away from the crown and atone for the wreckage left in its wake. As the sun rises over the valley, the two brothers share a simple meal of rice and vegetables. There are no silk suits, no multi-million-dollar mergers, and no one-way mirrors. There is only the hum of the bees and the steady, grounding work of tending to things that grow. Nayan looks at his brother, the man he once tried to erase, and finally understands that he is wealthier now in his obscurity than he ever was in his palace. The Iron King is gone, buried beneath the ash of his own pride, and in his place is a gardener who has finally learned that the only way to truly secure a home is to fill it with the one thing money could never buy, forgiveness.